Hello and welcome to the Joe Cannon Health Podcast. This is Joe Cannon and today is episode number 14, which aired the 18th of October 2019. The main topic for this week is going to be something that's been in the news a lot lately. It is the vaping epidemic, which seems to be gripping America. I want to talk about what may be going on, what we know, what we don't know, and really try to put the emphasis on the research that has been conducted on vaping. There has been some, and I want to try to bring it to your attention. But before we go any further, I want to talk about the myth of the week. This myth has been around for decades. It is the idea that if kids lift weights, that it will stunt their growth. And the idea here is that lifting weights will damage the growth plates of the bones. It turns out that the longer bones of the body, the bones in the arms and the legs, they have at their ends something called the growth plates. And we technically call these the epiphyseal plates, the growth plates, the epiphyseal plates. This is where the bones grow. When the bones grow, they grow at their ends. And the idea here is that lifting weights will damage those growth plates and lead to a child being shorter than he or she was meant to be. Is there any proof of this? Well, turns out there's really not. And intuitively, it makes sense that this is not really true. Because when you think about what kids do, what we did when we were kids or what kids today do, when they go out and they play baseball, they play football, they run, they jump, etc., they're already putting lots and lots of stress on the bones of their body. And, we don't see any problems with that. So what would be the idea of, say, strength training damaging those epiphyseal plates, those growth plates, when they're probably already subjecting those growth plates to even more stress just when they're going out and playing? There has been some research on kids and strength training. And before I recorded this episode, I went and I found a couple studies. I found a study was published in 2006 titled Weight Training in Youth Growth Maturation and Safety, an Evidence-Based Review. And I'll just quote the researchers at the end of this study. They basically say, experimental training protocols with weights and resistance machines and with supervision and low instructor participant ratios are relatively safe and do not negatively impact the growth and maturation of kids. Again, I think the operative word is supervision. Again, when kids are in a class that's supervised by somebody who knows what they're doing and the class size is small, we don't see any problems. Another study that I noted when I was looking into this was published in 2017, Resistance Training for Children and Adolescents. Again, just summarizing what the researchers said, multiple studies have since discredited the theory by demonstrating there is no adverse effect of resistance training in youth athletes when designed properly and is often completed injury-free. So again, no issues here. Again, the idea here is when students are under the tutelage of somebody who knows what they're doing and the class size is small, so the adult and the coach, if you will, can keep an eye on everybody. We don't see any issues. I honestly have never seen a clinical study, a case report, if you will, of any child seeing their growth plates damaged by strength training. There may be one out there, but I haven't seen any. So if this is a risk, the risk is most likely very low. And again, something to think about if you're thinking about involving your kids in strength training. Again, I think it's best to treat every child as an individual. Do they want to do any kind of strength training? Can they follow directions and work in groups? Again, these are some questions that I would want the answers to before allowing a kid to do strength training. Again, they may eventually, but again, it's something I think that the child and the parent should agree upon. Also realize for the parents listening to me right now that kids, especially kids who are below the age of puberty, they get stronger differently than adults. When adults get stronger, it's because their anabolic hormones are increasing in result of the exercise they're doing. When smaller children are exercising, they do get stronger. They really do, but it's mostly for different reasons. Kids, when they improve their strength, it's not really because their raging anabolic hormones are elevating. It's just the fact that their brain is learning to do the exercise better. And this in turn allows the child to become more efficient. And as they become more efficient, their strength increases. These are technically called neurological changes, and they result for the majority of strength improvements you see in kids. After they go through puberty, a different story happens. But in smaller children, it is mostly their strength improvements are mostly due to these neurological changes. So again, no evidence that I've ever seen that strength training can stunt growth. Again, we treat each kid as an individual. If they want to do it, we make sure they can lift weights and correctly, focusing on form and not the weight that they're lifting. I think if we put the emphasis on health and fitness and the form of exercise they're doing and not so much on the total weight they're lifting, I think this goes even more to reduce the risk of this ever happening, which again, I think is very low overall. So strength training, pretty healthy for kids, especially if they want to do it. I think it's a great thing. It leads to stronger bones and stronger muscles, etc. Now, I want to segue, if I can, away from this and talk about the topic for the remainder of this week. And that's something that probably isn't so healthy for kids. And that's this whole vaping thing that you've probably heard about. My interest in this really is born out of a friend of mine on Facebook who wrote some posts about how her kid he's 17 years old. And he found himself in the hospital and he was really, really sick. And again, we're like, what's going on? Turns out he was vaping. And she didn't know. And then, one thing led to another. And odds are you have probably seen this person on television. She's become very vocal. She tells her story whenever she can. She's pretty much been interviewed by everybody in America and even internationally. And I think it's a great thing that she's talking about it, because this whole vaping thing is something that I think has been flying under the radar for a number of years. I remember when these things were first marketed in America several years ago. They were targeted to help people get off smoking. And they still are to a degree. And I wanted to address that if I can in our time together this week. But since vaping has become so popular, especially in younger kids, we have unfortunately several kids who have gotten sick. Right now, the CDC reports that about 1,300 kids have been, and young adults have actually been hurt, mostly through lung injuries resulting from their use of vaping devices. Unfortunately, further, 29 people have died. The youngest so far has been a 17-year-old person. So very sad. And again, this results in a lot of news media coverage and, people talking about, what happened to them when they vaped, etc. And obviously, there's a lot of contention in this issue. I'm going to, I want to stick to the science. What do we know? What do we don't know? I know right off the bat, I'll tell you, I'm not a fan of the whole vaping thing. I don't understand it. Regardless of that, I want to take my personal feelings and opinions out of this equation as best as I possibly can. Because that's, I think we talk a lot about the stories, and the stories are good, and opinions are great, but I want to try to stick to the science as much as I can. So what do we know so far? Here is some of the research that I was able to uncover as I was delving into this topic. I also want to point out where I can the shortcomings of the research and what I hope to see in the future. So here's some questions that I was wondering when I delved into this, and I want to address some questions that I think maybe other people are wondering about as well. In terms of what's causing all these vaping problems that you're hearing about on the news, honestly, I do not know, and I don't believe anybody knows what's causing these lung injuries at this point. You hear a lot about some of these people who have had lung injuries and went up in a hospital that they were vaping products that contained THC. THC is the active ingredient in marijuana. That's the psychoactive ingredient that gets people high. And there have been some evidence out there that suggests that perhaps there is a link between THC THC in these vapes and lung problems, but I don't know if I totally believe it at this point. One study looked at people who had issues with vapes, and they noticed about 3/4 of these people, actually this included 573 people who had lung injuries, 3/4 of them, almost 75% of them, reported using THC in their vapes 3 months prior to getting sick. Now, that's really interesting, and that's why a lot of people, I think, are pointing to the THC, but also that means that a third of them, 33%, were not using THC. Some of the individuals, about 13%, were vaping nicotine in their vapes. They weren't using THC. So again, I think this goes more than just the THC. I've also heard references to perhaps vitamin E is involved. At this stage of the game, it could be vitamin E, it could be THC, it could be a combination of things. I'm not quite sure what is happening. And I think that should be something that people who are vaping should be thinking about. I don't know who's more likely to get sick. Could there be some kind of an underlying, it could be some genetic, and some people are more likely to get it than others? I can't tell you. And that's why I think that, people who vape should be thinking about that. I don't totally believe that when people say, oh, it's just safe. And we have several people who've gotten sick and some have passed away. So we know that it's not safe, at least for some people. Again, stay tuned for more research on this. And I know the researchers are scrambling to figure out what's happening. Eventually, we will figure this out. But as of right now, I can't tell you if it's something in the cartridges themselves. Are they knockoff brands that are causing this? We just don't know it as yet. So again, stay tuned. But for the remainder of this, I want to address some questions, again, to maybe help answer questions you might be wondering about, questions that I even wondered myself as I was delving into this. So let's talk about some of the questions about vaping and see what we can figure out. Number one, the first thing I wondered when I started hearing about all this was, how old do you have to be to buy these products? I see these things sold in stores. I see them, in 7-Eleven. I see them in Wawa. That's kind of like 7-Eleven here on the East Coast. So again, how old do you got to be? So as I looked into this, it varies from state to state, but it appears to be somewhere between 18 and 21 years of age to buy vaping products legally. I do predict that eventually that's going to go to 21 for every state. I think even as I record this episode, I see rumblings of states trying to push this up to 21. So I do think eventually it's going to be 21 for everybody. But right now it depends on the state. So you can look up, if you're in America, look up how old you have to be to purchase vapes in California or Nevada or Utah. Again, it's going to vary, but I do think eventually it'll be 21. That said, you got to wonder, because there are people who are younger than 18 who are getting sick. How are kids getting a hold of these devices? So as I looked deeper into this, I found an investigation. These were researchers at the Center for Health Policy, Science, and Tobacco Research, and they surveyed 1,700 adolescents between the ages of 15 and 17 years of age who vaped in the last month. And they wanted to know, where are you getting this stuff from? So basically what they noted was that 80% of these people, these kids, they reported owning a vaping device. 80%. Again, these are young people between the ages of 15 and 17 years of age, and 80% of them said they owned this. Well, they're technically not even supposed to be allowed to buy this. So where are they getting the vapes from? Well, these researchers said that about 30% of them purchased vaping devices online, went to different websites and just purchased it there. 16% said they bought it from somebody else. Okay, so some people may have a vape, they're not using it anymore. Maybe they bought a better vape, who knows? And then they sold it to people. So this is something that may be passed around from one teenager to another. It's one avenue. Another way, 15% said they actually gave an adult money to go to the store and buy it for them. So I thought that was kind of interesting. That kind of reminded me of, what they used to do in, the olden days when kids would pay adults to go and get beer from them. Apparently now they're paying adults to go and buy vaping devices for them. And also 70% of the people in this investigation said they actually borrowed somebody else's vaping device. So kids may not buy it. They may actually be just using the device, borrowing it from a friend. And again, even though the legal age is 18 to 21, they're finding ways of getting these devices. And, one thing I noticed as I delved into this is according to the National Institutes of Health, it appears that boys are twice as likely to start vaping as girls. Twice as likely. That actually quite surprised me because I remember in junior high school and high school, it was mostly girls who smoked cigarettes. I didn't see a lot of boys doing this. There were some, but it was vast majority girls. And, back then, I always just assumed that, boys were, less susceptible to peer pressure, I guess. But in the case of vaping, boys are more likely to do it than girls are. And I'm not sure why that is. I do know that, when people vape, they sometimes do tricks with the vapor and stuff like that. And maybe that's more susceptible to boys than girls. I honestly don't know. But so again, boys more likely than girls. What do these teenagers, the people who are vaping, what do they know? Young people, I shouldn't call them teenagers, younger people. What do they actually know about what's in the vapes? Do they know the ingredients? Well, according to the National Institutes of Health, most young people who vape don't know what's in these products. According to NIH, 66% of teenagers thought the vaping devices only had flavoring. Only 13% of teenagers knew the products contained nicotine. Nicotine is the addictive component of tobacco, of cigarettes, etc. This is what keeps people hooked. And only 13% of kids knew that vaping devices, many of them, contained nicotine. I do believe this is changing. As I was, again, delving into this, I looked at several packages online, pictures of the packages, and many of them now do say this contains nicotine. Again, hopefully their knowledge of vaping devices is going to be increasing as manufacturers step up and start telling people, hey, there is nicotine in this. Nicotine is addictive. Again, this gets to the question, which I'll address later on. Again, does vaping really get people off of smoking? And that's the big claim to fame, that it actually stops people from smoking. But in some people, it may stop them from smoking, but it doesn't get them off the nicotine, train, if you will. Essentially, people have just switched out one nicotine delivery system for another. And it went from smoking to vaping. If they both contain nicotine, you're still addicted to nicotine. Again, I'll talk more about that in a little while, but it is interesting that most teenagers may not know what is in the products that they're using. Now, speaking of the labels, I did look at several online, and I was happy to see that many of them were telling me that what their main ingredients were. A little bit of fuzziness here and there, but most of them, like for instance, looking at one that contains propylene glycol, that's very common. Vegetable glycerin, that's common. Terpenes, hemp. Natural flavor, again, natural flavor, that's vague. That could be anything. But I was also happy to see that many of the labels of these products I was seeing did have warnings on them, such as wash your hands and forearms thoroughly if in contact with contents of the bottle. Exposure to eyes is harmful. Flush with water if the product comes in contact with your eyes. When seeking medical advice, have the product or container in hand. I thought that was really a smart idea. If swallowed, rinse your mouth out, take this packaging and seek medical assistance. So I was really glad to see they actually said if you're having problems, go to the hospital and take this with you so the doctors can see. So I liked seeing that. Other packaging that I've seen, agriculturally grown industrial hemp concentrate rich in CBD, vegetable glycerin, propylene glycol, and stevia. I thought that was kind of interesting. Maybe they're trying to, make it seem like it's healthier than it may be. Vegetable glycerin and propylene glycol, very common in vapes, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The one I have seen references to pregnant women, consult your doctor prior to use, and do not use if tamper-resistant seal is broken or missing, and also keep out of reach of children. And also I've seen other packaging saying including pets as well. I want to call attention to the children, small children, because some of the vaping things that I've seen online, they look appealing to small children. So if you are vaping, please keep it away from children. They should not be touching it. One of the products actually looked like a little juice box, had apples on the front and stuff like that. So if little kids don't know what it is, it could really cause some problems with them. So be careful with small children and also pets. You don't want pets getting into this stuff. And in addition to all that, I would also say, women who are breastfeeding as well as pregnancy, I would not vape while pregnant or breastfeeding, because again, we just don't know what it does, and we don't know if the ingredients actually get into the bloodstream and get to the baby, or if you're pregnant or breastfeeding. So again, I can't say one way or another. When it comes to pregnancy and breastfeeding, I'm always going to be uber conservative and say, when in doubt, talk to your doctor, or just don't do it. Now, speaking of these flavors, they have very interesting names, coffee flavor, cheesecake flavor, cookies and cream, blueberry cheesecake, very appealing flavors to some of these vapes. One study that I uncovered basically noted that some flavors are perceived as being less harmful than others. That's very interesting to me. So, people who vape, they look at some as more harmful, some flavors as less harmful. Tobacco being perceived as the most harmful flavor. It's probably because it has a direct relationship to smoking. Overall, younger adults tend to prefer the sweeter taste of some of these flavorings, as well as menthol flavored. Non-smokers, interestingly enough, non-smokers preferred menthol flavors as well as coffee flavors. But the idea that flavoring plays a role in the perception of health, I thought was intriguing and definitely worthy of further research. Again, not a lot of research out there yet on the flavors, especially how those flavors are perceived by the vaping public themselves. So again, something to keep in the back of your mind. Now, another investigation, which I found very interesting, looked at the density, if you will, of the expired vaping gas. When people when they vape, they spew out that aerosol, if you will. I guess I'm calling it right. It's an aerosol gas, and they do tricks with it and stuff like that. The thing that causes a lot of this aerosolization of this water vapor and other compounds is glycerol, also called glycerin. Now, again, it's listed on the packaging of a lot of these things. Glycerin is, again, it's a sweet tasting compound found in vapes. Ironically, it's also found in other products as well, like moisturizers and stuff like that. But it is a principal ingredient in vapes, as well as propylene glycol. Now, the thing that is interesting about glycerol is that the more glycerol that's in the product, the more visible the expired aerosol vape clouds are. So that's quite interesting. So again, some manufacturers may, again, no idea of inside information, but they may experiment with the ratio of glycerin in these products to get a more visible cloud, if you will. Now, what does that do? Well, these researchers wanted to know if the cloud, if you will, the vape cloud, actually played a role in whether people wanted to vape or not. So they looked at 50 smokers, 50 people who smoked, and they smoked cigarettes. And basically they had them either watch somebody who was drinking water, that was the control group, or they had somebody vaping e-cigarettes with a high glycerin content or no glycerin. Remember, the glycerin content plays a role in how dense and how much vapor is put out when you exhale. And the higher the glycerin, the greater the cloud is exhaled. After they were done looking at the people drinking water or looking at the people vaping high glycerin vapes or no glycerin vapes, they had them fill out questionnaires, and they wanted to see what their desire was to smoke cigarettes or start vaping. And what they found is that people wanted to smoke cigarettes and do e-cigarettes when they were viewing people smoking the higher glycerol content videos. So when they saw somebody who was smoking or doing the vapes with the higher glycerin content, they were putting out a more denser gas, if you will, vape, if you will. And that, subconsciously at least, seemed to play a role in people's desire to smoke cigarettes as well as vaping. So that I thought was quite interesting. So it's something to think about. If you see people vaping, if you notice a difference in the density of some of the clouds, that's due to the glycerin. What effect is that having on the subconscious feelings of somebody who wants to start vaping? Again, not a lot of research, but I thought this was a very intriguing investigation. Now, while I mentioned glycerol and propylene glycol, these are very common in vaping products. They are often listed. They are often said to be safe and healthy and all that, and they're found in a whole lot of other products that you may have used. And while that is true, usually, however, when you're consuming, say, glycerol or something like that, maybe you're taking it through the mouth, or putting it on your skin or something like that, you're not necessarily heating it up. Remember, vapes have a cartridge in them that heats up a vaping coil, if you will, a heating coil, which heats up the compounds, which in turn, that allows that vapor to be exhaled by the body. Well, it turns out that propylene glycol and glycerin, when they're heated, they actually result in the formation of formaldehyde and acetaldehyde. Formaldehyde is a known cancer-causing compound, and acetaldehyde is thought to be a potentially a cancer-causing compound. So when people say they're safe, it really does depend on the route of use. Heating, even though the propylene glycol and glycerin are in these compounds, they appear to result in the formation of cancer-causing and suspected cancer-causing compounds. Now, what does that mean long term? I mean, if you're inhaling these cancer-causing compounds and expelling these cancer-causing compounds, I don't know what the long-term outcome of this. I could say it's not good to be inhaling a lot of this stuff. It doesn't, on the surface, appear to be safe. But again, I'm limited by the research that's out there, and there is no long-term studies of what happens to people if they've been vaping for 20 years or so. We have that data on cigarette smokers, obviously, but not yet on vaping. So again, I cannot tell you what this means. I can only report what I see, and that's that when these compounds are heated, they do form some cancer-causing compounds. Ultimately, what does that mean? I'll leave that for you to decide. And then that brings us to the main ingredient, the main addictive ingredient, if you will, of vaping devices, and that's nicotine. So is nicotine safe? Well, I guess it depends on who you talk to. Some doctors have actually pointed out that, nicotine may be as addicting as heroin. It makes sense when you think about it. People who are drug addicts have trouble getting off, say, heroin. People who smoke have trouble giving up cigarettes. And so what's up with that? Well, nicotine causes the release in our brain of a brain chemical, a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Dopamine is a feel-good chemical. And when we get that dopamine release, we want it again, and we want it again, and we want it again. And it does appear, at least in animal research, that the dopamine, you're getting it over and over again, it kind of rewires the brain and kind of teaches the brain, if you will, quote unquote, air quotes, teaches the brain that it wants to repeat that behavior to get another dopamine hit and another dopamine hit. So again, there does appear to be some relationship to nicotine and addiction. And interestingly enough, there have been some animal research, which is, quite interesting. It basically, they get the laboratory animals like mice, and they, subject them to nicotine. And the nicotine, eventually they like it, but the nicotine actually causes eventually these laboratory animals to self-administer cocaine. So in other words, what I'm saying here is that nicotine, at least in these laboratory animals, appears to be a gateway drug to getting laboratory animals hooked on cocaine. Very intriguing. Ironically, the reverse is not true. When you first hook them on cocaine, the laboratory animals on coke, they don't turn around and want nicotine. That could very well be because, cocaine is a greater inducer of dopamine than nicotine is. And if they're already getting the best stuff, they wouldn't want to go down a rung of the ladder. So again, it kind of makes sense in a way when you think about it, that they're getting nicotine and they want to get more and more and more. And so eventually they get the cocaine. They're like, oh, okay, I'm happy now. So again, this is why you'll sometimes may hear that, nicotine is a gateway drug that will maybe increase someone's chances of doing drugs, illegal drugs down the future. I don't know if we can totally say that across the board for everybody. Sure, there's probably going to be some personality habits and of the different people, which this may be true. I don't know if we can say it for everybody. But again, the animal research I think is intriguing. And again, I just wanted to bring it to your attention. Now, interestingly, again, kind of tangentially related to this, as I was researching this topic, I came across this unfortunate report of a 51-year-old man who injected himself with vape juice, the liquid in vaping. He apparently was not satisfied with just inhaling it. He injected it. Not a good idea. I'll just give you the title of the study: Near Fatal Intoxication by Nicotine and Propylene Glycol Injection, a case report on an e-liquid poisoning. This guy almost died. So again, fortunately, he did recover. I read this report. I can't find a reason why he would want to inject this stuff. Again, I would love to speculate that he wasn't happy with the inhaling. He wanted a greater hit. But again, that's just pure speculation on my point. This is a rare instance. I could not find many other instances of people trying to inject this stuff into their bodies. Not wise to do. Again, near fatal intoxication is how they titled this. So again, injecting this stuff is not healthy and definitely not a smart thing to do. But again, rare, but worth mentioning. So whether or not vaping is safe, again, all I can do is report what is out there at this time. We do have several people who had lung injuries. Some have died. I can tell you that between 2010 and 2014, there were almost 6,000 reports of e-cigarette calls to the poison control centers in America. The 10 most frequent adverse events reported to poison control centers resulting from e-cigarette use were as follows. The most common one was vomiting. About 40% of the people calling poison control centers reported vomiting. This was followed by eye pain and eye irritation. That was about 20% of people. Nauseousness, about 17%, followed by red eye or conjunctivitis. That's pink eye. I don't think vaping is giving them conjunctivitis, but I could be wrong. That was about 10%. And then down the line, we've got dizziness, tachycardia. That's a very fast heart rate, above 100 beats a minute when you're not moving. Drowsiness, agitation, headache, and then rounding out the top 10 is fits of coughing. So again, 6,000 calls to poison control centers. Again, that's between 2010 and 2014. These statistics kind of predate the whole stuff that's going on now with the lung injuries. So I don't have yet any more updated statistics. If I do, I'll update the show notes, episode notes on my website so you can see them. But right now, these appear to be the most up-to-date poison control center calls that I could find. Related to this whole idea whether vaping is safe, we can't not talk about the other elephant in the room, and that's the, I'll say, remote possibility that some of these devices could explode. And this has happened with sometimes really bad consequences. You may have seen some of this mentioned on the news. I'll just give you 3 fairly recent times this has happened. It made headlines. In May of 2018, a 38-year-old guy in Florida died after his vape device exploded in his face. Parts of the vaping device actually penetrated his skull, which apparently that's what caused his demise. And I apologize if there are kids listening to this. Little graphic, so I do apologize for this. February of 2019, a 24-year-old Texas man died when his vaping device exploded in his face. Parts of the device were actually stuck in his throat and cut off his carotid artery, and which again led to his not surviving. There was another report in June of 2019, not as bad as the other two. 17-year-old guy, vaping device explodes, broke his jaw and broke several of his teeth. He did survive, thank goodness. So again, these things do happen. They are, I think, comparatively rare to all the people who are vaping. It is a rare occasion for these things to happen. But I would point out that studies do show that between 2015 and 2017, there were about 2,000 e-cigarette explosions and burn injuries. That's according to people who actually went to the hospital. So again, it does happen. I don't think everybody dies when this happens, but it's the explosion kind of scary, and some people have unfortunately not survived it. So I do think that should be something that people should be thinking about if they're considering vaping. The one thing I would say when I looked into this is the reports don't highlight any one brand of vaping device. That's the thing I want to know. I like to try to boil things down to its essence. Is there one brand that's more likely to explode than others? And I couldn't find that out. I mean, we do hear about lithium batteries and exploding and stuff like that in cell phones, and so could it just be one type of lithium battery? Again, I can't give you an answer to this. Can't tell you if one brand is more likely to have this happen than others. Again, unfortunately, researchers don't seem to report this data. If they are, I can't find it. So that's unfortunate. Now, the reason that vaping was originally put out there was that it was going to help people not smoke or get off of smoking and transfer to something that was less dangerous to them. So does it reduce the risk of smoking? I honestly can't tell you whether vaping stops people from getting off cigarettes or not. There's some, maybe some evidence that it does and some it doesn't, but does it reduce the chances of somebody smoking? Well, according to the NIH, National Institutes of Health, it doesn't appear to be. Vaping does not appear to reduce the risk of somebody starting smoking cigarettes. One investigation noted that 30% of people who vaped eventually start smoking within 6 months, compared to people who do not vape at all. So again, 30% of people who start vaping within 6 months start also smoking cigarettes. In another report that came out in 2019, this was published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. This study involved over 6,000 people, noted that those who were vaping, they were 4 times more likely to start smoking. So again, whether or not it reduces the risk of smoking, I think is debatable at best. Again, it gets back to that whole thing, is vaping a gateway drug? Again, I'm going to leave that to your interpretation of the data. The data appears to show that there is an increased risk of starting smoking when somebody starts vaping. Why is that? That I'm not sure of. Is it because they're looking for a greater hit, want more of a dopamine hit? Can't tell you this at this point. But it does not appear to reduce the risk of smoking, at least according to the data that I've seen. So what does the vaping fumes, if you will, what do they do in the body? Do they harm the body? Is there any effect? Not a lot of human research at this point. As I looked into this, I can tell you there are studies that are now in the pipeline. They are not yet published yet. They will in the near future, but as of right now, these are the studies that I was able to find as I was investigating this topic. I found one investigation. This was from 2018, and these researchers wanted to know if the heating coil in these e-cigarette devices passed any metals into the inhaled aerosol vapor. Again, remember, these devices have heating coils. They heat up. These heating coils are made of metal. Do the metal in the heating coils make their way into the lungs when you inhale this stuff? So these researchers, they sampled 56 e-cigarette devices from people who were using them, daily users of vaping devices. And what they found was that some of these devices actually did in fact contain toxic metals when they were inhaled, such as chromium, zinc, manganese, nickel, and even lead. Lead was found in some of these devices as well. Interesting, in about 11% of the dispenser cartridges, they found arsenic, arsenic being a pretty bad poison. Low levels, I'm sure, but 10% arsenic, not a good thing in my opinion. Now, another investigation looked at whether these devices were harming blood vessels. And these investigators looked at 15 people. They were about 26 years of age. They did not use e-cigarettes, and they said they smoked less than 10 cigarettes per month. So here's what they did. On day one day of the study, they had these people basically for 30 minutes start vaping with a nicotine device. So the vaping device contained nicotine, and they basically said vape away for 30 minutes. In another day of the study, they said, okay, vape away for 30 minutes. Here are the vapes. These vapes don't have any nicotine. So one day they're vaping and the devices contain nicotine, and another day they did not have any nicotine in the devices. And what did they find? Well, it turns out that the vaping devices that contain nicotine, the nicotine actually tripled the blood vessel stiffness for at least 30 minutes after they were done vaping. So the nicotine appears to really ramp up the arterial stiffness of the body when they're vaping. Again, why is this an issue? Well, because if the blood vessels are more stiff, well, then that could increase the blood pressure, which is another thing they found in this study. And the heart rate could increase. That's another thing they found in this study as well. But down the road, stiffer blood vessels can play a role in heart disease. So again, I can look down the road 20 years and I can say, well, if the blood vessels are stiffer, well, then that could increase the risk of heart disease in the future. Can't prove it at this point. They only looked at 30 minutes later, but if you're doing this on a regular basis, 30 minutes, stiffer blood vessels, again, writing on the wall, can't definitively prove it, but again, it's just something that, again, I think people should be thinking about. By the way, this did not happen in the non-nicotine vapes. So if, somebody who's vaping, those non-nicotine vapes did not appear to have that arterial stiffening effect. Another study came out in 2016. 40 people are recruited in the study. 20 are smokers, 20 are not smokers. Basically, they use the non-smokers as controls, and the smokers, they basically have them smoke cigarettes for the first week. A week or so later, they say, okay, now we're going to switch from cigarettes to e-cigarettes. We're going to keep the nicotine content the same. So the cigarettes and the e-cigarettes both had the same content of nicotine. What did they find? Well, they found reduced levels of vitamin E. This is compared to non-smokers, by the way. Reduced levels of vitamin E. They also noted that both the cigarettes and the e-cigarettes with nicotine also reduced an enzyme which is needed to produce something called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a gas which expands blood vessels. It helps regulate blood pressure. Now, if you're not making this enzyme to produce nitric oxide, this could, in theory, play a role in jacking up blood pressure and also play a role as well in arterial issues as well, because nitric oxide is made inside the blood vessels. Flashback to that previous study we talked about where there were blood vessel stiffening problems and blood pressure went up. Could that be related to a reduction in nitric oxide? It's possible. Another study that I uncovered was not a human study, but actually a study of immune system cells of humans, specifically immune cells found in the lungs. Interesting investigation because, this stuff is being inhaled by the lungs. What's that doing to the immune system of the lungs? Well, these investigators noted that cinnamon flavoring, I should say, of e-cigarettes was actually very effective at suppressing several different important immune cells in the lungs, such as macrophages, neutrophils, and natural killer cells. Natural killer cells go out and they're basically like Terminator immune cells. They go out and find cancer and kill it. So the cinnamon flavor in some of these things actually suppressed the effectiveness of the respiratory immune system cells. And the researchers said this was a dose-dependent effect. In other words, the more cinnamon flavor they subjected these cells to, the worse the immune cells functioned. So again, other flavorings, can't say. This research only looked at the cinnamon flavor. And then one of the other things that people like to talk about when it comes to vaping is, again, it's safer and that it doesn't have the smoke, the vape, if you will, is safer than, say, secondhand cigarette smoke. Is it? Well, again, we're hamstrung by the lack of research so far. I uncovered one small study, only 9 people. Basically, they had these people start vaping in a well-ventilated room. They wanted to see what the composition of the air in the room was after people were vaping. Okay, so basically what they noted was that after people were vaping in this well-ventilated room, they had a 20% increase in compounds that are called polyaromatic hydrocarbons. Polyaromatic hydrocarbons. These are generally considered to be cancer-causing compounds. So in this study, these people are vaping. The air in the room has an increase in these cancer-causing compounds. So what does that mean for other people in the room who are not vaping? They're also then inhaling this stuff too. What's the ultimate ramifications of secondhand vape smoke? Do not know. I do not know. Again, we're hamstrung by the lack of research on this topic. But again, based on this, I would hope that restaurants, etc., will be putting restrictions on where people can vape, and like smoking. I would hope that people are not allowed to vape inside rooms, just like they can't smoke inside rooms. I don't consider, based on this small study, that the vapors, if you will, is safer for non-smokers who are in the room as well. So hopefully this helped you figure out better whether vaping is right for you. And hopefully it gave you a better lay of the land on what we know, what we don't know. As you can tell from what I've had to say here, there is a lot of unanswered questions as of right now. This is just something I wanted to get off my chest as I've been watching the news like a lot of you were, and I didn't know a lot about this product. I knew what I saw on television. I knew what my spidey sense was telling me as I was watching the advertisements, but never have I delved into the research before now. So hopefully, as I was learning, you're learning as well. If you come across any new research on vapes, whether they're safe or not safe, I hope you'll email me because I'm really curious to know more. And so that's all I got for you this week, guys. If you got to get a hold of me, the easiest way to do so is to email me through either of my websites, joe-cannon.com, joe-cannon.com, or supplementclarity.com. Hopefully that will help you get a hold of me easier. So the last thing I got to this week is the quote of the week, which goes like this: "Don't cry because it's over. Smile because it happened." Dr. Seuss. Until next time, gang, I'm Joe Cannon. Go out and make a difference.